now when you mention basically this idea of very complex issues and not being able to comprehend them and to sell them politically, I would like to open another topic that we can call is Black Lives Matter a good thing that happened, and why not? So, Danilo.
I would say conditionally, yes. It is, of course, a good thing that happened. But I say conditionally because I am a qualified ally of this movement, because, of course, a lot of the surface manifestations of it have really done this legitimate issue a great disservice and have been counterproductive in many regards, and have both tactically, in strategic terms, a lot of the movement, which is not very well organized, has really played into the hands of the reactionary forces, if we can really call them that for a moment. This is a long-standing movement. It's been around since 2012, 2013, 2014. It is raising a lot of legitimate issues, sometimes not very precisely in a way that sociologists at a Harvard seminar would raise them, but has changed the ideological spectrum to an extent that ideas like systemic racism, institutional racism, some examples of which I gave you at the beginning, I mean, which is there. We in sociology know how, there's a series of studies that the late a professor who unfortunately died in Harvard, but she's famous for, with Bruce Western, popularizing a study with CVs, just to show you an example. The labor market in the United States is tremendously skewed, and they showed this in an experimental study where you send CVs with identical information. Everything is identical. The only difference is that the name in one CV is a kind of white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant kind of Američko ime, like John Smith or something pleasant sounding like that. And in the experimental CV, it is an African-American name like Letitia or something else. Everything else controlled for. And then tremendous differences in how many callbacks they get, right? In my building, in William James Hall, there is a woman called Benaji, a psychologist, social psychologist, who pioneered these implicit association tests, which really have demonstrated in enormous samples just how much implicit racial and other bias there is. So, these many of the solutions to these real substantive issues are premature and simplistic and overly, unscientific and so on. But the fact that the problem exists and that the movement is drawing attention to them is, of course, important. It's much further than police brutality in particular. Racial inequality on the side of the probability of somebody getting fatally shot doesn't necessarily even exist, as best we know, on the question of getting fatally shot in particular, whether the victim is white or non-white. But of course it exists in a much wider realm surrounding the probability of getting pulled over, the probability of getting brutalized, the probability of getting non-lethally manhandled by law and order representatives, not to mention moving outside the police sphere. See, I think that the Black Lives Matter success is going to be ultimately a matter of, do they successfully communicate the message that it is not just about the police shootings, and that the police shootings are a kind of trigger, occasion, surface manifestation of something that is plaguing American society for a long time, and that something has to be done about it, because America is going to be a non-white society very soon, and already is in youth cohorts, and already is in many battleground districts in places like California, right? So Cornel West, can I tell you one anecdote that shows, to me at least, the successful expansion of the Black Lives Matter moment and why it can be successful? Cornel West, the great, and he's also an interesting, not theologist, but an interesting philosopher of religion that I know Davor appreciates. They called him on one of these MSNBC, NBC or something to bemoan American racism, and then this indignant, quasi-hysterical speaker asked Cornell, but what about this racism in Baltimore or whatever? And Cornell said, yes, like the veteran activist that he is since the 60s, he says, yes, but we shouldn't forget that there's this thing called American militarism, and that there's this thing called Afrikom in West Africa, which is a infrastructure of American bases around the world, but also, for example, in West Africa, where we are killing people like insects with drone strikes. And let's now talk about how racism domestically has been historically connected to American imperial racism of the sort in Haiti, or would you like to talk about Africa today, right now, where we are? And so he basically said, to Emmett, did you know that there are people of color living in Africa? Did you know that? They don't just live in Baltimore and Ferguson and so on. They also live in Africa. And American military power is something we should talk about. And this speaker, you should have seen this, but this speaker is like, what the hell is this guy talking about? Blue screen. You know how when the computer goes dead and you have that blue screen? This NBC, I forget who it was, one of these famous anchors, he just went, he's just like, what the hell is this guy talking about? And so that's an illustration of how there is a tremendous opportunity within the Black Lives Matter movement, not for the kind of superficialities and the theater, which is characteristic of all movements, but for things that have never been really on the agenda to be put on the agenda. It's very valuable.
Let me try to bring you maybe some counter arguments, because I consider I'm really highly critical against Black Lives Matter. Why? Yes, there is issues of racism in United States. It's obvious when you see all the percentages. I don't know, prison population, victims of police brutality, etc., etc. However, what is my issue with Black Lives Matter is that it simply puts a wrong focus to something, and then it really does not allow us to go into the core of the problem. And this is my thesis. What is the core of the problem? So for me, racism is a narrative that is a false narrative that came up as a legitimization of extreme capitalism that was treating people as objects, even legally, because slaves were objects, not subjects of law. And what we have, if we think about life as a kind of a social relay race, where previous generations are giving us the relay button, and then we simply move on further, and then we give the button to the next generation. The Black people simply started later than the others. They were freed later. They entered into this social relay race later. And the America as a society that was never supporting the poor people simply kept this Black community on a level of poor. And they are epitomizing the poor people in America. Of course, some of them were extreme fast runners, like Jordan, like Oprah Winfrey, and they made up this difference. They caught up but majority of population cannot. So what we have here, and this is my thesis, that United States police is not brutal against Blacks, but it's brutal against poor. And it happens to be that the Blacks are the symbol, and this is the visual identity of Blacks. These are the poor. And basically, when we talk about racism, we are talking about fake story that should cover up the real story of inequality. And the only way effectively to fight racism is not to say that Black Lives Matter, but basically that, well, let's turn it into a Poor Lives Matter. Because what would happen, let's take it, what would happen if the Black people by some magic would disappear from the United States? Would the US police become less brutal? I think it's plausible to say no. They would still be brutal to the poor ones, only there wouldn't be Black people, there would be some other people who are poor. And basically, for me, Black Lives Matter is turning the focus onto this racist issue, while the real focus should be on inequality issue. The fact that American society is example of extreme capitalism that is not lifting up the lower levels of society, it does not allow. And yes, we do have some examples of racism in Europe, but it's even not close extreme as in United States. And that would be my key problem, that there it's simply turning the wrong focus.
Can I now, since there was a thesis and antithesis in a Hegelian manner, I can offer a synthesis of both. I see partly I agree, but just in part with what you said, because it is both, it seems to me. It is a deeply rooted racism, which is, of course, not exclusively American problem, but it's there, and it is part of just, as we have been talking about it practically all the time, class warfare. So yes, there is that, and there is also this unfortunate, how to put it, disentanglement between the question of race and then the question of class warfare that have happened. And if we go back to Malcolm X or King, in there you'll find that they very closely associate the issue of racism with class warfare. So that is not something to be treated as a separate thing. However, very often the discourse is constructed in such a way that it becomes a separate issue. And just also a footnote to what Danilo said, that's a big problem that very many people who consider themselves liberal and on the left end of the political spectrum actually have this deeply absorbed racism that they just don't call that way. They call it bringing democracy to the rest of the world, or fighting or defending the country and stuff like that. So where they protest and they're very vocal, targeting people if they by mistake use the word black, but they have no problems in going after and exterminating hundreds of thousands and millions of people of a different color and race and religion elsewhere in the world. So it is, I would say, a double problem. And of course, a big part in that is also this deeply seated ideological narrative that has to do with certain religious ideas that strangely enough and problematically enough got very closely intertwined with corporate interests.
No, but what is the effect of Black Lives Matter? It basically has an effect or in extreme underlying of this only the racial aspect of the story. Yes, there is racism. I think there is no dispute about it. But the social effect is basically antagonizing the poor black population against poor white population instead of the general poor population antagonizing against the elites. And this is my problem with it. I think the story, the narrative is going into a wrong direction. Yes, there is racism, but how to solve it? Do we solve it by only putting a finger into the eye of white people, like, you're racist, and blaming them for that? Instead of
doing that, though, I'm not sure they're doing that. I don't agree. If you look at, first of all, if you look at their manifesto, for example, it's not a membership organization. So it's very difficult to say who they are, exactly what they are, and so on. If you look at a lot of these photographs of the actual events, you will be shocked to see that they look like you and I, and they do not look like, in terms of phenotypical skin color. You'll see more white kids from suburbia. American white kids from suburbia are notoriously often much more engaged in some of the hysterical stuff on BLM than actual minorities. Second thing is the messaging of resentment and the messaging of kind of anti-white discourse is really marginal within that movement. And it's something that I think the Republicans are very good at kind of misportraying as some kind of mainstream view. But there's a big difference between anti-white messaging and pro-minority empowerment, which I also agree can be taken too far. I take your point, and I agree that sometimes as a tactic, they forget that class and race are, of course, conflated. You don't need to convince me. Believe me, you're preaching to the choir. Sociologists have spent 30, 40 years trying to explain to people how this stupid debate about this reductionism, let's reduce everything to race or let's reduce everything to class, like the Marxists, is a waste of time, and it's a tired unproductive debates that never make sense except of some very, very technical question like the particular effect on a particular outcome in like academic settings or in prison settings, or sometimes we can say that class is more important than race or race is more important than class. But for the most part, in the real world, of course, they are conflated. They're especially conflated in the US. I mentioned this book, Deaths of Despair. A lot of that book is very interesting in showing the balance between racial and class effect. But I think on the movement, as best you can, if you look at their manifesto, for example, I think they even have the opposite problem of what you're describing, which is they buried any particular issue in like a laundry list of pleasant, Santa Claus wishes, ranging from, queer emancipation to the neoliberalism to dismantling capitalism as we know it, on top of the racial and the class and the right. So in a certain sense, they even have the other extreme of kind of too many demands. And I don't think it's true that they single out race, except in the name. But if you talk to most people who,
I'm not claiming that they are. However, I'm talking about the perception that is that exists, and we should not be. Really, it takes the focus of the real thing, and I really believe that the real thing is issue of redistribution. Because if we would solve this in America, then we would start maybe getting some other quality. And
but it's not a fake issue. That's all I want to push back on. When you say like, oh, the race is it's not fake. I mean, they
racism exists.
It's too strong to say. Maybe the emphasis on race vis-a-vis other things should be adjusted sometimes. Certainly true.
Exist. This is what I started, I think, in the beginning. Racism does exist in America. It's clear thing. Prison population, all the fact. This is a fact. However, how to approach it? Is a racism some kind of issue per se, or is it, as I see it, kind of an instrumental narrative in order to legitimize some agendas? And this is, I really see it. There was a famous, really good quote that I like from the movie Mississippi Burning, when Gene Hackman comes and he is a Southern and he explains to the FBI colleague who is not, and he tries to explain this economical aspect of racism. And he talks about his father living to a black neighbor who had a mule, and the mule was poisoned. And he says he knew that his dad poisoned the mule, and his dad is a poor white Southern. And simply he was asking why. And the father gave him an answer: if you ain't better than a Negro, son, who are you better than? And this racistic story has even it's even instrumentalized in a way that, yes, you are poor, but at least you're better than, because you are not black, which is completely fake, of course, but it still exists. And somehow, if we would go, wow, this is at least my feeling, if we would go above the story of racism and simply wipe it aside and really focus on inequality, social inequality, we would start solving racism together with it, which exists. This is no matter. I'm talking about emphasis, and that my personal dislike is about wrong emphasis as I see it. Davor?
A lot of them do that. I just want to, in their defense, a lot of them do. Notice how the Trumpian and the Republicans are accusing Black Lives Matter not of some black stuff, but they're accusing them of being Marxist, which is the buzzword they've been using. Like they're a Marxist organization. They're going to take your suburbs. They're going to. So the narrative on the side of criticizing them is very much the class-based one, for what it's worth. But I think you're right. I think if I can also find another area of disagreement, agreement, consensus between us is, given that we have this common regional background. Look, if you tell me Americans in general overemphasize race as a factor, I agree with you 100%. If you tell me Europeans underestimate race as a factor, I agree with you also. So I think there's also a kind of transatlantic divide, including among the intellectuals. I see it in my job where if you're teaching like British Empire and colonialism to American students, and you start to talk about the importance of religious, sectarian, faith-based differences, they're looking at you like, for example, they read about the Scottish and the Welsh and the Irish and how they were maltreated by the English, and the American student on a whole, because he's programmed to think about racial categories as the end-all be-all, is going to look at that and say, what is this? A bunch of white boys are killing each other, and why the hell does that matter? How could they possibly, right? Similarly, in Yugoslavia, for example, we have very little problem understanding the importance of the Catholicism and the Orthodox Christian, let alone the role of Islam in Bosnia or something like that, right? You don't need to explain to people from our side of the world that religion matters. On the other hand, because we had a different history, obviously, don't necessarily take sufficient account of ethno-racial, particularly race. When I say race, I mean it in this American sense, not in the ethnic. Ethnicity is another example of something that Europeans are much better at analyzing, including the academics, than Americans. And I think that's a reflection of the different historical trajectories, and it's very hard to. So I think there's a lot of miscommunication in that regard as well. I think a lot of Europeans, when they hear the Black Lives Matter thing, they're just like, because Marxism is such a stigmatized, this class-based determinism that you're talking about, where class above everything is so stigmatized in the United States for 100 reasons, ranging from the Cold War to look at what happened to this Bernie Sanders campaign or insurgency based on the poor decision to use socialism as a buzzword, and how much that cost him, and the constant defensiveness that he had to go through for even using the word. Well, yeah, in Serbia, you can have Milosevic destroy the whole society under the banner of Socialist Party of Serbia, and 30 years later, you can elect a guy who is proudly saying, I am the Socialist Party, and now he's president of our parliament, and nobody blinks an eye or has any kind of problem, because there's a different sensitivity to the idea of socialism, Marxism, class-based analysis, which is alien. Americans, it's very alien.
In support of your argument about different perceptions, yeah, I did meet this kind of attitude. The one and the only time I was in the United States on University of Vermont, there was some debate institute, and a guy, he was a Southern professor driving his Jeep with a big Confederate flag on the back window, on the back window of a car, and I mean, horrible person. And I remember him asking me, "I don't get you in Yugoslavia. Why are you waging any war and there are no blacks at all?" And I really could not understand what this man is talking about. And then I realized that he has this weirdo understanding of like, okay, why any conflict is if there are no different races.
It's a blind spot, right? It's a blind spot. And everybody has their blind spot. Let me give you another illustration. Regionalism in the United States is a hugely important variable, if you want to put it in the kind of quantitative, I'm not a statistician, but I can show you 10 articles which demonstrate that on the question of, for example, the crime rate, and is the crime rate disproportionate in the minorities or the immigrants? It's not, by the way. In the undocumented immigrants are one of the forces decreasing the crime rate in the United States, believe it or not. But that's a separate funny story. Regional differences between North and South are tremendous in the United States, and a lot of the difference in crime rate can be interpreted as a difference in regional. Most of the crimes are committed in the South. The crime rate is vastly disproportionately accounted for by southern states, and it just so happens that in these southern states you have the racial distribution, right? And so when they're having this argument about, is it poor people who commit crimes disproportionately, and because poor people happen to be disproportionately Black and Hispanic, that's why, or is it because something in the Black and Hispanic population as such, perhaps the marriage structure or whatever it may be, and then that's why the disproportionate crime, and all the while, class race, like parrots, they're arguing about it. There's a bunch of different issues. Youth, I mean, there's a lot of cohort effects. there's a lot of the gang violence in the United States has to do with I mean, these are interactive also. It's not like we have to choose between them. Let me give you an illustration concretely. So a lot of the ethnography about and the criminology in the United States about gang violence goes into the field in these inner city neighborhoods, which are not all poor to begin with, and which are not all Black and Hispanic to begin with. So you have, for example, a third of inner city neighborhoods are middle-class Black families who are more conservative than the American average family, who are, for example, more religious church-going and who have a stricter parenting style than, right? But because they happen to be in this inner city neighborhood that is stigmatized as criminalized and dangerous, they get treated not just by the police, but by everything from the education system to they get treated as if they are criminals. And so within these inner city neighborhoods, you have a bunch of families who are a small minority where it's a single family household, one mother, right, taking care of, say, 1 or 2 children, and she has to work 2 jobs, which is certainly connected to the labor market story that you've been emphasizing rightly. So she has to work 2 jobs, but the kid gets back from school at 2 p.m., 3 p.m., and she's not there. And there is no adult supervision for a whole bunch of these young kids. And that's a generational age cohort effect, because we know one thing in the sociology, which is the children need adult supervision. And the criminologists have really shown that the one thing you don't want to do is let children without adult supervision. But because of the structure of a lot of these families and the pressures for her to work 2 jobs, so she's off working job, and then every study finds the same thing, which is the gang becomes the surrogate family. The street gang adopts, metaphorically speaking, a lot of these children, and children, 15, 16, 17, sometimes younger. And a lot of the story of the violence, the gang violence at least, not most of the violence is not gang violence, but gang violence is a big piece of it, is a story of this unaccompanied, no adult supervision young people who have no other socialization processes, who have no other model of, how am I going to get ahead? What is my social mobility? What is my sense of honor and sense of pride and sense of masculinity, if you want? And then this gang provides this to them, and it's a very difficult, vicious cycle so it's just an illustration of how, it's a residential issue, urban sociology issue. It's not just race and it's not just class. And when it is race and class, they are intertwined with the education system that is very unforgiving. If he drops out of high school, another example is he drops out of high school, his chances of going to prison are astronomically bigger, So the education system is a disaster. So one last, I'll shut up, I swear, and I know we're going, one last illustration. What the coronavirus situation illustrated phenomenally is, if you take something like New York education system, right? Like every good crisis, it revealed all these things that everybody had been sweeping under the table and pretending like they don't exist in America. It turned out that you have hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of children who are homeless, and who, because of the lack of or hundreds and hundreds of thousands of children who have no source of food except the food that they have, because their families are at such a level that they have to get the free food in the schools, otherwise they don't eat, or they get malnutrition, right? They eat, but they eat garbage. And, and this just came to the surface from Corona, but that's the kind of thing that is a recipe for all sorts of social problems, and somehow they have to get addressed. And there's an education part, and there's a political mobilization part. And I agree with you that BLM has not been good at balancing those, but they have to be somehow.
But one thing that I would, for example, this is one thing that we are getting a wrong focus: police brutality. So why U.S. police is more brutal than in Europe, and this is the fact of life. And
it depends which country.
Yeah. What it depends?
Depends which country. I don't think it's more brutal than many West European countries.
Look, German police, Dutch police, Danish police, Sweden's police, even the French police.
They kill more people?
Who? Swedes, Danish.
How many people do they kill? I don't know about the statistics. Maybe you're right, but I think a lot of the states that I did see statistics for, they're not. I mean, per capita terms, they're not so bad.
Who?
The Americans.
No, the Americans, yeah. But the idea and the feeling of police brutality, and basically what I read somewhere, I forgot about the statistics that the brutality is higher in the United States, and the police is trained in this way. And the reason why,
that's true. Yeah.
The only logical explanation for me is that the only way how to keep the society with such a high tensions, because the tensions in European societies are relieved through the redistribution that we have in most of countries, and basically the police is the force that should be keeping society in, one of the forces, of course. And then the police brutality is for me then focused against the enemies of the system, which are poor, and the black people are the picture of the poor, and they're simply trained, because this trainee of police brutality is amazing thing that you have in the United States, the practices that you have. And for me, the only explanation is this is the way how to treat the social pressures that exist in the United States, because the inequalities in the US are significantly higher than in Europe. I think we agree upon this, because this is there is no redistribution. No, I mean, even on the left side, I remember Hillary Clinton replying to Bernie Sanders when he proposes the free education, and she even does not argue against. She's like, "Come on, Bernie," as if he proposed that people should fly. This speaks about Davor.
Yeah.
What would be your standpoint?
I think it has been a fascinating discussion, and I really would like to thank Danilo for his time and his contribution. And since there are so many questions that will get, I think, even more complicated over the next couple of weeks and months, I think we should have Danilo fairly soon back in the global living room.
Thank you guys for having me, and it was a joy to rant with somebody as opposed to ranting by myself to myself. So that was a real pleasure, and you gave me a lot to think about. Thank you. And yeah, call me back so I can tell you about my excellent book that is coming out, available on Amazon at an affordable price.
$9.99. Thank you, Danilo.
Hooray for neoliberalism in that regard.